Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Holden has spent years concealing facts that might destroy entire legacies behind walls of silence and shame. But he finally broke on that chilly, rainy night at Newman Enterprises, when thunder boomed like an omen and lightning smashed through the glass windows. The truth could no longer remain hidden because it was so painful and heavy. Holden was confronted by Victor Newman, the formidable patriarch who created an empire through manipulation, control, and secrets, and he demanded answers with that familiar cold gaze. Mitch stood just behind him, nervous and perplexed, not realizing that his entire life was about to be rewritten. As he started speaking, Holden's voice wavered, each syllable revealing years of hidden suffering. "Victor, you're not just Mitch's mentor, you're his father," he began, his voice breaking under the weight of what he was about to admit. The room fell silent. Unbelief, rage, and unadulterated emotion filled the air. Mitch's jaw dropped as if the earth had suddenly collapsed, and Victor's eyes narrowed, half in shock, half in rage. Victor had thought for years that he had buried his past deep enough that no one could find it. Holden, however, had been present from the start. He had witnessed everything, including the covert relationship, the hasty choices, and the lies told to preserve authority and reputations. Like a confession he'd practiced for decades but never dared to speak, Holden's came out. He disclosed that he had a brief, passionate affair with Margaret, the woman who gave birth to Mitch decades ago, when Victor was younger and his empire had not yet fully established itself. When Victor refused to accept the child, Margaret, afraid and alone, had gone to Holden for assistance. Holden, who was Victor's employee at the time, was instructed to handle the situation quietly, and he succeeded in doing so by making arrangements for Margaret to leave Genoa City and begin a new life somewhere else while guaranteeing her kid would never learn the truth about his father. However, Margaret passed away at a young age, and Mitch was raised to believe that Holden was the one who had kindly assisted him. He was unaware that Holden was guilty of being the person who had kept him apart from his biological father. Holden's remorse became more each time Mitch advanced in the corporate world and Victor complimented him on his commitment and intelligence. It was lyrical cruelty. Victor had unintentionally fostered the rival of his own son, and without realizing it, adored his own flesh and blood. The truth was now known. Mitch yelled, "You're lying!" In a broken voice, however, Holden's tone had a quality that prevented denial. Victor's face stiffened, but there was a glimpse of dread in his eyes. A rare, almost human vulnerability. "Holden, you'd better explain every damn detail before I destroy what's left of your life," he stated slowly in a tone that was dangerously calm. Holden's hands trembled as he handed him an ancient folder that had been sealed, aged, and crumpled by decades of dust. There were letters, Margaret's letters, in which she identified Victor as Mitch's father and confessed her anguish. Even a DNA report that Holden had concealed proved the connection beyond a shadow of a doubt. With his head spinning, Mitch staggered back. His father was the man he had always looked up to, envied, and battled against. You knew, didn't you?" Mitch said, tears welling up in his eyes. "Victor, you were aware of something. You did it every time." Victor did not immediately refute it. His silence was louder than any denial could ever be as he only gazed at the papers. Holden continued, his voice full of regret. He described how, after learning of Margaret's pregnancy years later, Victor decided to let Holden take care of it, in order to prevent controversy. A secret child would have been a liability for Victor, who had to defend his kingdom. However, Holden had not anticipated developing feelings for the youngster he was meant to remove from Victor's narrative. Holden was unable to carry out Victor's icy order after Mitch reminded him of the humanity Victor had long ago buried. Rather, he stood guard from a distance, making sure Mitch had every chance in life. And Holden discovered, without even realizing it, that fate had returned him to his true ancestry when Mitch, a gifted and ambitious man, eventually arrived in Genoa City years later. But when Holden witnessed Victor and Mitch at odds, a father and son at war without even realizing they were related, his guilt became intolerable. That was the last straw. He was no longer able to bear the load. With tears shining in his eyes, Holden remarked, "I thought I was protecting everyone. But all I did was ruin lives." Mitch looked aside, his fist so tightly clutching Victor's desk edge that his knuckles went white. His identity's defenses were crumbling all around him. He recalled every encounter, every hurtful remark, and every instance in which Victor had written him off as a mere pawn. How many times had he attempted to gain the respect of the man who had given him life? The irony was intolerable. Conversely, Victor was finding it difficult to keep his cool. His entire existence had been based on power and dominance, on manipulating others to suit his needs. However, this reality went beyond any corporate deception. He was immediately plagued by the realization that he had abandoned his own blood. Victor murmured softly, his voice quivering beneath the surface. "If what you're saying is true, then I've made the gravest mistake of my life." Once more the room was silent. At last, Mitch looked up at Victor, his eyes glimmering with rage. "A mistake," he yelled. "You consider it a mistake to turn your back on your own son? Because of your arrogance, you destroyed lives." Victor attempted to extend his hand, but Mitch withdrew, his face showing hurt and incredulity. When Holden saw what he had unleashed, he could hardly tolerate it. A wound that might never heal had been opened by his confession. However, there was no turning back now. Everything would change once the secret was revealed. The Newman Empire shook in the days that followed. Genoa City was rocked by the discovery. Everyone, especially Victor's closest friends and family, demanded answers. Not because Victor had cheated on her decades ago, but rather because he had concealed yet another huge truth from everyone. Nikki was incensed. She claimed that he was living in a web of deceit so dense that even he was unable to distinguish between lies and the truth. She remarked angrily, "You always think you can control everything. But this time you've destroyed something you can't rebuild." In the meantime, Mitch vanished for several days while attempting to come to terms with his new circumstances. Mitch would not listen to Holden's attempts to communicate with him. Mitch remarked icily, "You had decades to tell me the truth. It's just words now. It's too late to extend forgiveness." Victor, on the other hand, battled regret, something he hadn't had in years. He mentally replayed every exchange he had with Mitch, noting how frequently he had recognized himself in the aspirations and obstinacy of the younger guy. It was heartbreaking to realize how eerie the likeness had always been. For the first time, Victor Newman desired redemption over power, but he was unable to reverse what he had done. He made another attempt to contact Mitch in order to explain, but Mitch refused to see him. The betrayal was too profound. Years of antagonism had already put the father-son tie to the test, and it now rested on a thread of bitterness and broken trust. Guilt-ridden and shunned, Holden was used as the scandal's scapegoat. He was accused by Victor of interfering and playing God with people's lives. However, Holden was not going to give up this time. He angrily remarked, "You can't destroy me for telling the truth." It was the first time someone had talked to Victor in such a fearless manner. "You destroyed yourself the day you told me to hide that child." Victor was unable to reply, because Holden was correct in his heart. Strength and control were the cornerstones of Victor's history. But this time, the truth had overcome him. Holden's claim that Victor Newman was Mitch's biological father was eventually verified by a DNA test. The Newman brand and reputation were rocked by the news, which went viral in the media. The media was overwhelming, investors were terrified, and longtime adversaries like Jack Abbott saw it as a chance to take action. But in the middle of the mayhem, Victor was thinking about the son he didn't realize he had, not about business. Late one night, he was by himself in his office, gazing at an old picture of Margaret holding a newborn that Holden had given him. He touched the picture, his hand shaking. For the first time in years, his voice broke as he murmured, "I should have been there." Mitch, meantime, was caught between anger and grief. He had long been characterized by his independence and his will to succeed on his own without assistance. He now had to acknowledge that his father was his biggest adversary. The emotional cost was intolerable. He recalled all the times Victor had disregarded his thoughts, disparaged his aspirations, and undermined his ascent. It was more than simply business. It was an inadvertent attempt by a father to ruin his son. And now he was alive because of the man he had hated. Holden also had to deal with the fallout from his admission. He lost everything, including his career, his reputation, and the brittle trust of people around him, even though he had finally let go of his burdens. But he experienced an odd calm in spite of the expense. At last, the truth was revealed, and although it had ruined a great deal, it had also set him free from decades of suffering. When Nikki confronted him, he said, "Secrets are like poison. Even if you bury them, they will always come to the surface." As the weeks went by, Victor and Mitch gradually started to confront each other once more. Not as adversaries, but as two shattered men attempting to comprehend the connection that destiny had cruelly concealed from them. Following the revelation, their first meaningful talk was quiet, honest, and filled with unresolved pain. Victor stated in a hushed voice, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I'd like to get to know you, not as a business partner, as my son." Mitch paused, feeling conflicted. A part of him desired to leave forever in order to exact the same punishment on Victor as he had. However, a tiny wounded part of him yearned for the father he never had. With a shaky voice, Mitch remarked, "You can't just erase years of lies." It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a start. "But maybe we can start somewhere," Holden observed from a distance, aware that his admission had triggered a significant event. They had been shattered by the truth, but it had also offered them a shot at something genuine. Victor Newman had to deal with the fallout from his humanity for the first time in decades. Even though he was still damaged, Mitch started to see that his ability to forgive was his greatest asset rather than his independence. Ultimately, Holden's disclosure humbled Victor Newman, in a way that no corporate conflict or scandal could. It forced him to confront his heart, his past, and his decisions. Even while healing would take time, one thing was certain: the truth had at last been revealed. Mitch was now family, not simply a coworker or a competitor. And even though it was birthed in sorrow, that one truth altered everything forever. The days that followed Holden's admission were like an eerie echo that would not go away. The rumor about Victor Newman's secret son was circulating like wildfire across Genoa City. Speculation was rife in coffee shops, boardrooms, and even the Newman media studios. How could the legendary Victor Newman, a symbol of perfection and control, have concealed a son for decades? And how could that very son be Mitch, the man who had established his reputation for tenacity and self-reliance? However, the true harm was occurring in secret, in the unadulterated, unsaid suffering between Holden, Mitch, and Victor, behind the public spectacle. At the ranch, Victor would spend restless evenings in his study with his family's photographs lining the walls and the fireplace flickering. He gazed at the faces of Nikki, Nick, Victoria, and Adam, and now he could see Mitch's in his imagination. He felt proud and ashamed at the same time. Victor used to hate Mitch's power, tenacity, and resistance, but now he felt like a harsh reflection of himself. However, the past was irreversible. For the first time in his life, Victor Newman lacked a strategy, a plan, or a method to make things right. Mitch, meantime, was drowning in uncertainty and rage. He shut off calls from everyone, including his closest buddies, and secluded himself in his apartment. Old wounds had been torn open by the disclosure. He was lying about everything he believed to be true about his past. The guy he had looked up to as a mentor, Holden, had participated in the fraud. And his father was Victor, the man he had hated and fought against for years. One night he whispered to himself, "What kind of world is this where the man who left me gets to call me son?" The resentment was intense. He saw the shadow of the man he vowed never to become every time he looked in the mirror. Conversely, Holden was a shadow of his former self. His career, friendships, and tranquility had all been lost as a result of the confession. However, he felt deep down that it was the correct thing to do. Lost in contemplation, he wandered the town's periphery during the day, occasionally visiting Margaret's grave to pay tribute to her. One afternoon, while kneeling in front of the grave, he muttered, I told them everything." Even as he remarked, "You can finally rest now." He was certain that peace would not come easily for him, Victor, or Mitch. Then the unexpected moment arrived. Victor arrived at Mitch's house a week after the reveal. Long shadows were created across the room by the city lights outside because it was late. With a stern, resentful expression, Mitch grudgingly opened the door. "You're brave to come here," he remarked icily. Victor remained unflinching. He answered, "I didn't come here to fight." Mitch chuckled grimly. "I came here to talk to try to understand the son I never knew. Do you now wish to comprehend me? After decades of disregarding me? Reluctantly, he moved aside to let Victor in, but the tension was oppressive. Victor scanned the penthouse, focusing on the walls that held pictures of Mitch's achievements, including awards, family portraits, and recollections of a life Victor had missed. Victor remarked softly, almost admiringly, "You built all this yourself." Mitch turned abruptly and said, "You didn't need anyone." "Thank you, but no. Remember how you left my mom behind?" Victor's eyes softened, but the guilt remained. "You left her to die alone while you built your empire." "I was naive and conceited," he remarked. "I can't go back on the decisions I made." Mitch laughed hollowly. "But I didn't know about you until it was too late." "Is it too late?" "That's practical. You constantly manage to change the narrative so that you come out on top." The ensuing hush was harsh. Victor appeared to be about to go for a brief time before something broke inside of him. His voice faltered as he turned to face Mitch. "Do you really believe that I don't regret it? I think about the children I've failed and the individuals I've harmed every day. But you were taken from me before I even had a chance," he said, pausing to steady himself by holding onto the back of a chair. "I don't want to be forgiven. I don't even anticipate comprehension." Mitch's rage turned to doubt as he said, "But I want the truth between us, not the lies that Holden or anyone else told." Though years of animosity wouldn't go away quickly, he could see the sincerity in Victor's eyes. "The truth is that I spent my entire life trying not to become you," he remarked angrily. "I now realize that I already am." The words wounded worse than any business deception, and Victor averted his gaze. He said, "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. I'm pleased of the sturdy thing you've built, even if I had nothing to do with it." Mitch's face softened a little, the first break in the barrier he had erected around himself. He asserted, "Pride does not erase abandonment. You can't just show up and use words to fix it." "No," said Victor, "but it's a start." The two men started running into each other more frequently in the days that followed, sometimes on purpose and other times by chance. There was still no reconciliation and no apologies. However, acknowledgement was something new. When Mitch joined a board meeting at Newman Enterprises, Victor stopped viewing him as an outsider. Their chats were incisive, but they also contained a lot of unsaid emotion. Both seemed to be pushing the limits of a precarious new reality. During one heated debate, Victor said, "You have your mother's fire." "But my temper," Mitch said icily. Victor grinned for the first time. It was tiny, but it was genuine. Observing from a distance, Holden was relieved to see even a hint of understanding developing between them. However, he was aware that the harm he had caused would be difficult to repair. Mitch had completely stopped talking to him, and Victor still hadn't forgiven him for keeping the secret. Standing outside Newman Towers one afternoon, Holden observed the structure that had come to represent both his greatest accomplishment and his biggest transgression. He considered permanently leaving Genoa City, but there was a part of him that wanted to stay to put things right if that was still possible. That opportunity was unanticipated. Nikki pursued Holden, her face halfway between sympathy and rage. She remarked icily, "You broke this family. But maybe you can help mend it," she said, explaining that Mitch's emotional spiral had been caused by bewilderment, guilt, and rage. Victor was making an effort, but each time he tried to establish a connection, Mitch appeared to distance himself from him. Nikki whispered, "He doesn't trust anyone. Victor is the least of all." Holden paused, "But he might still listen to you." "He won't," he declared. "He despises me." "Perhaps," Nikki answered, "but only you can provide the answers he still needs." Holden went to see Mitch that evening. With a tired but attentive expression, the younger man opened the door. "You have 5 minutes," he replied sternly. Holden gave a nod. "That's all I need," he said as he entered with a tiny package in his hand. "Your mother owned these," he remarked. "Before she passed away, she penned letters. I stopped her from telling you who your father was." Mitch froze, staring at the package. "I thought I was protecting you. Why are you giving this to me right now?" Holden let out a sigh. "Because you should know her truth, not mine or Victor's." He turned to go after giving the letters to her, but Mitch stopped him. Why did you hold off for so long? Holden turned around, regret shining in his eyes. Because I was a coward. Because I believed that everyone would be spared suffering if the secret was kept. But I was mistaken, he continued softly. I loved you like a son. It hurt too much to tell you because of this. As Holden departed, Mitch remained silent. However, tears welled up in his eyes when he opened the letters later that evening. Margaret spoke in a kind, heartbreaking, and hopeful manner. Despite his ambition tearing them apart, she had written about Victor as a man who had previously loved her sincerely rather than as a monster. She had written about her hopes for Mitch, and her conviction that he would eventually discover his calling in life. If you ever meet your father, don't hate him, she wrote in a tragic note. Love him enough for us both, Mitch said, shattering his defenses. For the first time, he recognized his father as a man troubled by his own shortcomings rather than as a villain. Mitch arrived at the ranch the following morning. Staring out over the property while sipping coffee on the patio was Victor. He got up as soon as he noticed Mitch. He said, I didn't think you'd come. I didn't either, Mitch answered. After a protracted period of stillness, Mitch set the letters down on the table. He remarked, I read these last night. After a moment of hesitation, Victor unwrapped one and said, They were from my mother. His face softened entirely for a brief moment as his gaze swept across Margaret's well-known handwriting. Mitch whispered, She never stopped loving you. Victor took a deep breath. And I've always regretted losing her. The ensuing discussion was neither boisterous nor explosive. It was honest, unvarnished, and quiet. Mitch described to Victor the years he spent pondering his father's identity and the anguish of growing up in the dark. For once, Victor listened as a father rather than a businessman or patriarch. At last he added, I can't change what I did. Mitch looked down, his eyes sparkling, and said, But if you'll let me, I can be here now. Victor, you don't know how to be a father to me, he remarked. And I have no idea how to